Get started. My name is Quan Lamar Blunt-Hill. I'm an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice at Arizona State University. And today I'm going to be presenting on ecological mediators and moderators in norm change models of violence prevention. So much of the work that I'm doing in this area draws from social ecology and models of social ecological theories, specifically Bronfenbrenner's 1979 ecological systems theory. And in accordance to this theory and models like it, social ecology comprises really both the layers of social and physical environments that constitute the habitats that people exist in, that they carry out their daily lives in, including, for instance, interactions that result in violence. The theory is a bit complicated, but essentially it sees the individual as at the center of a number of ecologies, a number of social systems and environments that help to shape how that individual interacts with others in their environment. And so you have from the individual to the microsystem, that is the families, friends, direct contacts of an individual. Also, you have the interactions between those direct contacts. So it could be that I live in a house and have a microsystem of a family, but those family members interact with each other in the same way that they interact with me. And so their interactions with me are important, but also their interactions with each other may influence the environment in that house. And so this is called the mesosystem, right? But then there's also exosystems. There's social systems that exist outside of, say, for example, that house, which impact the social interactions within that house. So this would be things like, well, if I live in a house and my parents live with me, wherever they work, wherever they go to school, if I have children, wherever they go to school, or wherever they play, will have an impact on how they interact with others in that social environment. And there's two other systems I identify within this theoretical model. One is the macro system, that is the larger set of cultural and societal norms that govern how people behave. So this may be a set of norms that originated outside of the hypothetical house that I keep referring to. However, I may share, for instance, let's say American values about what an appropriate role of son is, or an appropriate role of father, what an appropriate role of the family and the various members of it are, that are influenced by this larger macro system of cultural norms. Finally, of course, all these things take place within the context of a chronosystem, essentially the chronology by which these systems evolve, that is evolving within this dimension of time. And so norms, values, relationships all play out over time. And when you put all these things together, you now have a much greater and comprehensive picture of the social environment in which we all participate. And so a few definitions. Just assuming that an entity is something that has some sort of separate and distinct existence, and that something social when it relates to human societies or interactions between humans, then you get social entities, right? These things that are separate and distinct and that relate to human activities. And that can include things like organizations, right? And so organizations or other sorts of social, or rather community violence interventions, for instance, which I'll get into in just a bit, can be considered social entities, these separate and distinct existences that have a social impact. Community violence is essentially violence that occurs in public places. And community violence interventions are actions, programs, or other strategies for interfering with the otherwise expected outcomes of community violence. They're often community-based, meaning that oftentimes these strategies for interfering in community violence are programs that are community-based programs, based or housed in community-based organizations that essentially have active and meaningful involvement of a wide range of community members, usually people for whom public safety is not their primary profession, but that they are involved in addressing public safety as members of a neighborhood and really as in-group members of a local community. So CVIs are social entities, right? They are these programs, these strategies that have a separate social existence. They're different than all the people who make them up. It's when we come together and form this organization that we become something different than just Quan and you, but we become a CVI. And these CVIs exist now in the same kind of social ecologies and realms that I do. So just like Quan has a microsystem and a mesosystem, a macro system and a chronosystem, exosystems that impact the interactions within all of those. A CVI itself also exists within the social ecology. Now, this is important because my colleague and I, Jay Scola is also a professor at Rowan University and is working with me on this. And we're also working with Michelle Starrett over at Widener University. We wanted to ask, well, how have we as researchers considered the social ecologies of CVIs? Oftentimes we talk about the effectiveness of CVIs and we talk about what's required to make them effective. And many evaluations of CVIs, including, for instance, really popular models like the cure violence model, have taken into account the fact that, for instance, program fidelity and the ability of a program to keep with its intended model can be impacted by external factors. However, very few, and really we're not aware of any scholars who have focused specifically on all of the non-model, non-built into the intervention factors that influence the causal chains, the claims, theories of change of these programs, particularly those programs that base their theory of change on norm change. So this would be community violence interventions that suggest that they reduce violence by changing the norms, the attitudes, the behaviors of local neighborhoods that would otherwise incite violence or encourage violence. And so we argue that those programs exist in a social environment that should impact the ability of that causal chain, right? The ability of norm change to have an influence on violence. So we asked, what are the microsystemic, mesosystemic, exosystemic, macrosystemic, and chronosystemic factors that influence the effectiveness of CVIs? We did this by looking at programs in Philadelphia and Chester, Pennsylvania. So these are programs close to New Jersey. You can see that they are different in size. Philadelphia is much larger than Chester. Chester is essentially a suburb of Philadelphia. And so by focusing on programs in these areas, we're essentially focusing on programs within the greater Philadelphia metropolitan area. It is a majority minority area, particularly with large proportions of Black and African American residents. You can see that the education rates are a bit different between the jurisdictions themselves, but in part, that's because we're looking at Philadelphia as a whole city within these numbers. Obviously, there's great variation within the neighborhoods within Philadelphia. There are two programs operating in Philadelphia and Chester. These programs are called Philadelphia Ceasefire and Chester Ceasefire, though both of those programs are run under the same organization. And so Philadelphia and Chester Ceasefire have the same executive director. They have the same team of program managers, even though they have their own on-the-ground staff workers. Both programs implement what's called the cure violence model. So essentially, they're using what are called credible messengers, these people who have connections with the types of networks that are at risk for violence and may be at risk for other criminal activity. And they use those individuals with those connections who have not only had a history of those connections, but have also now in the present changed their philosophy of life, change their behaviors, and are trying to exert a more positive pro-social influence in their communities and environments. And they use those as credible messengers. These are people who can speak to at-risk, typically youth, who may be involved in networks of violence and can be persuasive on the ability of those youth to change their lives and to really resist utilizing violence as a conflict mediation strategy. So what we wanted to do in order to find out more about the social ecology in which Philadelphia Ceasefire, and Chester Ceasefire operate was to conduct a survey of neighborhood residents so that we could better understand, for instance, something closer to that macro systemic set of norms and attitudes that they were trying to change, right? And so while these programs tend to focus on at-risk individuals, people at high risk for being involved in violence, they operate within a larger neighborhood context that is expected to either make it more difficult for them to change those at-risk individual norms or to facilitate the change of those at-risk individuals. We also did a number of interviews with important social actors throughout Chester and Philadelphia. This included, for instance, in Philadelphia, city and state government, police department representatives of the local philanthropic community. This also included in Chester, community-based organizations, representatives from the police department, and the local prosecutor's office. When presented with conflict scenarios in our survey, we're beginning to find already some preliminary findings. And I say preliminary because both surveys and interviews in both locations are ongoing. And so we've not yet reached the samples that we're interested in getting, but we're focused on that. And as you can see in the prior slide, we've gotten, for instance, in our survey sample, 77 responses. We've completed, I believe now, 12 interviews across the two jurisdictions. And so in understanding the social milieu within which these programs operate, we asked, for instance, in the scenario where a person goes to a party and someone bumps into them and the person swings at the respondent, how likely would they be to respond in a number of ways, including a physical response, that is engaging in violence as a conflict mediation strategy in that situation. And we saw up to 62% said that they would. When hanging out with a friend and someone trying to also physically assault their friend, up to 50% of respondents said that they would respond in a physical manner. If they're at a party and someone shows up with items that were taken from that, to 36% of individuals would engage in physical fighting or violence. If someone was identified on the street as having assaulted the respondent's brother in the last week, 35% would respond with a physical response. And then this drops off to about 17% and 13% in situations where, say, in a bet or a deal, someone owes money, but they refuse to pay. All other of the scenarios that we came up with had 10% or less than 10% that would react in any way that was physical. And we drew these questions from a prior evaluation of cure violence, really the only one that we're aware that attempted in this way to actually measure norms in the way to measure change in norms. So using those same questions, if these items reflect the types of norms that programs like Philadelphia Ceasefire are trying to change, then we needed to know what are the distribution of those attitudes in the larger population that's influencing those programs. We also found that about 46% of our sample had been shot, 24% have been stabbed, and 59% have been threatened by a gun at some point in their lives within the neighborhood. 61% thought that violence was a problem in their neighborhood. And only 24% had not seen a gun, meaning that actually 76% had in fact seen a gun in their neighborhood within the last year. Only 9% had not heard gunfire. So many had actually, in fact, heard gunfire. Only 22% had not heard of someone threatened with a gun. Only 22% would assist the police if asked. And 53% noted that they never would. And so you can see now the larger normative context in which these programs are operating. However, of course, 22% reported that the neighborhood was not close or not close-knit, meaning that a majority actually reported that the neighborhood was close-knit. And only 40% said that they do not share the same values within their neighborhood. But that's still a significant minority. When we talked to policymakers or other influential social actors about some of the major factors that influence the effectiveness of CVIs in Chester and in this case, the Northwest neighborhood of Philadelphia, we heard a couple important themes. One, at the individual level, capacity. influences their ability to carry out any model, any CVI model. So that programs that don't have the professional development or other internal capacities to actually carry out their model tends to be a major reason why theories of change, while they may work in the abstract, are not always seen as effective on the ground. At the microsystemic level, that is, in the interaction between CVI programs and those that they're directly contacting, that is, the public that they're trying to influence, but also other CVIs and other local government officials, competition for funding and political and public attention seem to be a major theme that took a lot of attention from CVIs as they tried to do things like raise money or ensure that they were in the public eye enough to get services funded. Coordination between CVIs and the local government, that is, direct coordination between CVI representatives and government representatives, was also noted as a place where there were a lot of weaknesses, meaning that the coordination with, for instance, city governments that would be needed to supplement the services of specific CVIs were found lacking. Government and public communication also was seen as very important at the mesosystemic level. That is, outside of the direct environments of CVIs, how government interacted with the public outside of those CVIs was also important because it set things like how many people would be willing to call the police and thus whether individuals even had another recourse to conflict management outside of physical or other violent reactions. Also, public perceptions of effectiveness were also influenced a lot by government's communication of changes in, say, crime levels. At the exosystemic level, political change was noted as something really, really important. So, for instance, specifically, when city governments changed political administrations, you ended up having a lot of changes that impacted programs' ability to carry out their models. At the macrosystemic level, things like social distance between policymakers and CVIs and those who CVI served were seen as a major influence impacting the ability of programs to execute their models. And this occurred even in Philadelphia, where many of the government workers themselves were people of color and so shared racial or otherwise cultural identities with those being served. Finally, at the chronosystemic level, time was noted as a major factor influencing how programs were able to execute their models. So one of the challenges, for instance, was the fact that grants by cities to programs were often made on a year-long basis, which meant that programs very early on, almost as soon as they reached the money or received the money, were already having to focus their attention on how to get money for the next year. As a person tells us, if an organization knows that there's a 3-year grant period, for instance, you can just plan a lot differently than if it's only for 1 year. There are also a lot of expectations on these programs that don't take into account the fact that their models are norm change models, which require relationships that take time to develop. And so often programs are called on to demonstrate their effectiveness very early on, but that this can have an influence on how it is that they attempt to execute their models. So models, norm change models, that would work much more effectively if the implementers had a longer view of implementation, are essentially rushed and have all the causal mechanisms that should make them effective compressed within arbitrarily short timelines. And so in terms of some of our major takeaways, we really want to dive deeper into how policymakers and researchers set expectations of these programs, given the time context and social context in which they're operating, how consistently we, as citizens, as governments, et cetera, policies account for larger public discourses and political environments that influence these models, and how well understood is the role of time in CVI work. And so as we continue on in the future, we'll be continuing surveys, continuing interviews. After we collect up the findings from these, we'll be engaging in what we're calling participatory theory development. So really discussing with practitioners our findings to figure out if there are other major factors that we aren't identifying or how to interpret these findings. And then ultimately, we like to operationalize some of these so that in future evaluations, you not only evaluate program logic, theories of change, but also program contexts so that you can see to what degree the outcomes you observe are influenced by factors external to the CVI themselves. And with that, I suppose I can open up to any questions.